Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. Gold text on a white background. Live from NYPL logo. Live from NYPL presents The Last Million, David Nasaw with Atina Grossmann. December 15th, 2020, 8 p.m. EST. This slide contains an image of the featured book jacket. There is a black and white photograph showing two light-skinned figures pushing a cart with blankets and belongings piled on top through the snow. White text reads, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War, David Nasaw. Black text on a white background. The Last Million is available for purchase online from the library shop, nypl.org/shop. All proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Plus, receive a free commemorative 125th anniversary tote bag with your purchase. This slide contains the same image of the featured book jacket. Black text on a white background. Reserve a copy of The Last Million for free with a New York Public Library card. Available through Simply E on iOS and Android. Accessible formats are also available. Find out more at nypl.org/talkingbooks. Black text on a white background. Recommended reading. David Nasaw suggests these titles for further reading. Displaced Persons, Growing Up American After the Holocaust by Joseph Berger. Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany by Atina Grossmann. The Wild Place by Catherine Hume. Savage Continent, Europe in the Aftermath of World War II by Keith Lowe. The Walls Came Tumbling Down by Henrietta Rosenberg. Reserve these titles by visiting tonight's event page, nypl.org/live. Accessible formats available through nypl.org/talkingbooks. Contactless checkout is available at more than 50 grab-and-go locations, nypl.org/grab-and-go. Black text on a white background. Live from NYPL upcoming events. Wednesday, December 16th, 8 p.m. EST. Investing in Each Other. Aminatou Sow and Anne Friedman with Rebecca Traister. Making friends isn't easy, particularly now. Neither is holding on to friendships. The hosts of the hit podcast Call Your Girlfriend explain why you need to fight for them. Thursday, December 17th, 8 p.m. EST. So long, 2020. Join some of our favorite comedians for a bit of relief as they look back on the year that was and what it has meant to be a New Yorker, a funny New Yorker, during these tumultuous times. Featuring Michelle Buteau, Matteo Lane, Aparna Nancherla, and Ophira Eisenberg. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.
Good evening. Thank you for being with us. I'm Bill Kelly, the Andrew Mellon Director of the Research Libraries, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation with the eminent historian David Nasaw about his most recent book, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. Professor Nasaw will be speaking with Atina Grossmann, a distinguished professor of history at Cooper Union. We're delighted to have both David and Atina join us at the virtual library. You can find their full biographies on the event listing, but I'd be remiss not to say how much we've all been looking forward to tonight's conversation. Simply put, David Nasaw is one of this country's most important cultural historians. From his early work on schools, urban childhood, public amusements, through his remarkable biographies of William Randolph Hearst, Andrew Carnegie, and Joseph Kennedy, to the book he'll be discussing this evening, David's career has confounded facile distinctions between history told from the bottom up and history told from the top down. David's work has disturbed that binary by insisting on the intertwined complexities of the past and by a concomitant demand for an historiography that honors and records that interplay. That sensitivity is fully on display in his new book, Drawing on a deep reservoir of primary sources, David traces the tangled networks of post-war global diplomacy and recuperates the machinations of the structures of power then in play. He grounds that overarching analysis in the experience of the displaced peoples whose lives were shaped by that discourse, masterfully weaving the warp and woof of the local and the global, the abstract and the concrete. The risk of the subject is, of course, relevancy, and to be sure, The Last Million resonates strongly with current concerns about migration, citizenship, nationalism, identity, and displacement. But David never loses sight of the people he's writing about. He never reduces them to precursors, surrogates for contemporary tragedies. At the same time, his account fuels our empathy across time and place. That he is able to do so is a consequence of both craft, a commitment to getting the facts right, and art, a talent for narrative design that resides in the extraordinary sentences and paragraphs David writes. Twin skills through which his account of how we lived then informs our understanding of how we live now. You can purchase The Last Million, as you've just heard, from the library's shop. I urge you to do so. You will be enriched by the experience of reading this book. Before I turn the screen over to Atina and David, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, tonight's event is being recorded, but you are not. Only what you see on screen is recorded. Real-time captions, for those of you who are interested, are available via stream text. That link appears on the Zoom and YouTube platforms where tonight's program is being streamed. Again, thank you for joining us. David, Atina, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the New York Public Library for allowing me to join David Nasaw in this conversation, which I think I'm particularly excited about because as a historian of Germany and the Holocaust and the Nazi period and the post-war period, I've spent so much time sort of mired in the history of one particular group, Jewish displaced persons, and to have read David's book and to have seen the story open up in this, extraordinarily capacious, but also, so sensitive to individual and group experience manner has been really very, very exciting for me and also very impressive. And I'm very curious, David, to hear more about how you managed to do this, because you've written a big book, right? Not just in terms of pages, but in terms of content and themes and questions. I think it was the New York Times review maybe that noted that this was one of those books that clarifies without oversimplifying, which may be like the greatest compliment that a scholar who writes a big book can receive. And so I wanted to just start by asking you about this decision to take the big picture approach, because again, from where I come from, really what you've done is you've taken, and certainly in the way that you begin your story, which is on the one hand telling these individual atrocities that were perpetrated on European Jews, and then also mentioning who was perpetrating them and kind of taking us in an arc throughout the book of both sides of that story and who ends up where. That you are telling a story about Jewish faiths and the experience of Jewish displaced persons, but you are putting it in this much broader context of displaced persons in general, the majority of whom, as you point out, were not Jewish and were not Holocaust survivors, and also in the context of really big power politics. And so I just wanted to ask you about how you came to sort of think about that particular combination and the positioning of these different groups to all of whom you give a voice?
I wanted to tell the big picture story. There had been wonderful books, including your own, about pieces of the larger picture, but no one had put it together in a way that I tried to put it together. I don't think you can really understand what happens to the Jewish displaced persons without understanding what happened to the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Latvians, the Estonians, and putting it all together tells a much bigger story. It also tells a story of the Cold War.
Yes.
And it tells a story of how humanitarian interests and humanitarian concerns were, if I could use the word, trumped by geopolitical concerns. This is a story of how World War quickly morphed into Cold War, and how millions, I talk about 1 million, but there were millions more of civilians, most of them innocent of any war crimes, who were stuck in displaced persons camps in Germany, while the nations of the world debated what would happen to them. This began for me, I think, I don't quite know how it began. It's always the toughest question I get. Tony Judd's book, Post-War.
I was thinking about Tony's book, yeah.
Yeah, it opened up. It made me think. I've taught that book a couple of times. When you teach a book like that, you get into the weeds with it. And I began to realize that I didn't understand anything about what happened when the war was over. And I wanted to counter, not only tell a story, but to counter the triumphalist, happy days, good war narrative that I grew up with, and that I think my students have grown up with. The World War was over. The sun came out to shine. Hitler killed himself in his bunker. The war was over. And the Americans and the British and everybody else said to the Jews, who they had not helped during the war, to the survivors, welcome. Well, that's the story I grew up with, but it's far from the true story, which was the one I wanted to tell.
So, but again, I'm thinking you are someone who has done spent most of his career in American history and writing about American social history and writing about biographies of famous people. And here you are telling a story that really takes place in many different, in many different places, from Washington to the Ukraine to DP camps in Germany, to Italy, to Palestine. And part of my question, again, as a just, people interested in this craft of the historian, is how did you manage actually to pull this together, even in the sense of doing the research? And the number of archives that are listed in your bibliography, just the initials already are dizzying. And then to actually do all that research and then somehow manage to convince a trade publisher to let you put in all of those footnotes, which is also something that is quite a feat. So that I think people can read this on so many levels. Some of us will dig into the footnotes, and other readers, like maybe many of you listening tonight, will be really captivated and heartbroken and surprised or angered or by the stories that you're telling. So maybe you could tell us something about just the process of doing the research and figuring out what kind of book this was going to be.
it became clear to me, certainly in the books that I've written, the biographies that I've written, that to tell US history and to stay within the continental United States is just wrong. It's stupid. We've learned it. There is no such thing, certainly in the 20th century, as an insular US history. You can't tell the story of US history as America first or last or in between. The United States is part of the world. It has been part of the world in the 20th century. And it was certainly part of a much larger world in the World War II era and in the post-war period. So I've learned that, and a lot of this came from my students and my colleagues, that American historians have to go beyond the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Canadian border and the Mexican border. And they've got to tell a larger story because America is in the world and part of the world. Now, when it came to the story of World War giving way to post-war, merging into Cold War, there was no way to tell this story by staying in the United States. If you tell the story by staying within the borders of the United States, you get it all wrong. Wars do not end with the cessation of hostilities. They carry on. World War merges into post-war, and in this case, into Cold War. And to tell the story of the World War, you can't stop when the Germans capitulate or when the Japanese surrender. And to stop there doesn't get it, doesn't paint a true portrait, a true picture. Plus, for the displaced persons, they are stateless for a period of time. And to tell history and to circumscribe your story within national boundaries, whether it's Poland or the Soviet Union or Latvia or the United States, doesn't get the texture, doesn't get the reality, doesn't understand or doesn't allow one to understand the pain and the suffering that war breeds. That's number one. Number two, how can a historian, a US historian in the late 20th century not be drawn to the topic of immigration and refugees? I mean, you have to. And all history is written from the present about a past that's connected to that present. And I had no choice. The subject matter forced itself upon me. I didn't shape it as much as it shaped me, and it shaped my book.
Right. And it happens to be a subject about which there are enormous amount of memoirs and official documents and archival collections. And one of the sort of interesting paradoxes is that the amount of even journalistic reportage about this period is so overwhelmingly large, and yet for a long time, this immediate post-war period was seen as just an in-between moment that even the people, whether it was Jewish DPs or whether it was Latvians or Ukrainians or Lithuanians or Poles, saw as this moment of in-between. And yet in your book, it emerges as the stuff of global drama as well as of individual stories. And so I'm interested in this. I'm interested really in many things, but one question has to do with the ways in which you're interconnecting the political history and the political interests of the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, just for starters, right? As well as of a nascent Jewish state in Palestine, as well as of, as you put it, nations in exile. So you're telling a story that has to do with so many different national politics, all of which have very different reasons, it seems, for taking an interest. I mean,
Yeah.
becomes sort of remarkable to me, again, even though I know this, that, for Britain, it was preferable to give up mandatory Palestine than it was to allow 100,000 Jews into Palestine. For the Soviet Union, their fear of infiltration by anti-communist elements and by fascist elements was so great that it precluded their staying within an alliance. For the United States, it really messed up many of their options for continuing relations with the Allies. So that's something I think that is really, I'm interested in how that works out for you.
Europe after the war, Europe in 1945 is devastated. It's destroyed. The displaced persons, I talk about the last million who were left behind in Germany, but there are tens of millions of displaced persons. The map is changed. The map of nationalities and the map of nation states are changed. The hordes of people who wander stateless because they can't go home again, or like the Jews, they have no homes to return to. It confronts the American soldiers. It confronts the aid workers. It confronts the British soldiers and the occupying forces. Americans don't know that story because we are stuck in our, insular mode, and we think the war is over. It's done. I think that the Cold War really begins around the displaced persons. There are 1 million displaced persons left in Germany. The Soviets say, send them home, except for the Jews and the Spanish Republicans who are left behind. The Jews can't go home. The Spanish Republicans can't go home to Franco. But everybody else, the Poles, the Latvians, the Yugoslavs, send them home. And if they don't want to go home, it's for one of two reasons. If they want to stay in displaced persons camps in Germany, it's because they're war criminals,
right?
They were Nazi collaborators, or they're too damn lazy to return and rebuild their homelands. The Americans and the British say, no, we're not sending anybody back to Soviet tyranny. We are going to keep people in the camps until we decide what to do with them. The Soviet response is, well, the Americans and the British must be planning World War III. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Americans and the British and the French went into the Soviet Union to try to overthrow the new regime. After World War II, maybe they're keeping these displaced persons as a reserve army. So the Cold War really erupts, I think, over the debate about what's going to happen to the displaced persons. Eleanor Roosevelt in the UN says everyone should have an opportunity to choose their country. Molotov says, what is this? Gromyko says, what is this nonsense? These people have homelands. Let them go back to those homelands. The debate goes on and on and on and on. And meanwhile, in the camps, there are not only the innocent Poles who were brought to Germany as forced laborers, as slave laborers, to do the work of the German soldiers on the Eastern Front, but there are the Jews. There are the Jews who, a minority, come out of the concentration camps and the death camps. The majority come out of the Soviet Union, where they have survived the Holocaust because they crossed the border and they found refuge in the Soviet Union. They worked hard, it wasn't easy. But when the war is over, they come back to Poland, and then they find that the anti-Semitism in Poland, when the war is over, Hitler's death, the fall of the Nazi regime, does not end anti-Semitism.
No, in fact, I wanted to just press on that point about who the survivors actually were, and the fact that the vast majority of them had actually become survivors because they had escaped Nazi occupation one way or another, and had survived in the Soviet Union because it's so much. The first place ties together the story of the Cold War and the reasons why it's so hard for surviving Jews to enter the United States. But it also, raised for me this question that I struggle with all the time in, just in my own work on, more Holocaust focused work, which is sort of dismantling certain fixed ideas about who we are actually dealing with. Like you're dismantling one myth about, the greatest generation, or about, this sort of wonderful moment in Times Square where, VE Day was celebrated and the US was the hero of the free world. But there is also, I think, still a very deeply embedded sense in a general imagination, but also in a Jewish imagination, that the survivors were people who had survived the camps, or maybe they'd been hidden children, or maybe they had been partisans, but this fundamental fact that, as you point out, at the end of the war, Jews are only a tiny, I think you said something, 2%, a tiny minority of this vast human conglomerate of displaced people, of uprooted people. By 46, 47, they're 20%, a quarter. That's a different population. And I'm just wondering, how you felt when you sort of realized that. Was that something you always knew? Was that a surprise? Is that something that still surprises your audiences? Because I think what you've done in this book is that you not only change our understanding of sort of international and global politics and the particular role of the US in that moment, but also a certain kind of understanding of the history of the Holocaust and who the survivors are.
Yeah, one of the most frightening statistics I came across, and I came across it early, was, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that 80% or 90% of the Polish Jews who survive the Holocaust survive it because they cross the borders and they spend the war in the Soviet Union. Now, I mean, that just hit me over the head.
Yeah.
But the next part of that story is that they spend the war in Kazakhstan, they spend the war in the Asian outposts of Soviet civilization. When the war is over, Stalin, and I don't entirely understand why, anti-Semitism obviously has something to do with it, and his fear that the Jews are a nationality and they're not going to become they're not going to become the new Soviet man and woman, they're going to be Jews. Stalin provides railroad cars. Once he's moved all the Soviet soldiers back into the Soviet Union, he takes those railroad cars and he moves 250,000 Jews back to Poland. He says, if you want to go back, you can go back. And almost all of them want to go back.
Right.
And they come.
Not if they're on Soviet citizenship. Right.
Yeah, the Poles. And they come back, and then I read, and it's heart-wrenching, story after story after story of Polish Jews who've been away during the war, and they come back to Poland, and they go to their hometowns, and they go to their houses, or they go to their apartments, and they're greeted at the door by non-Jewish Poles who said, "We thought you were dead. You don't belong here anymore. There's no place for you." And then come the pogroms and the violence and the irony of ironies. I mean, history, when you dig deep, becomes much stranger than fiction. The irony of ironies is that these 200,000 to 250,000 Polish Jews, the only place they can find security and safety is in Germany, the land of their murderers. In Germany, in the displaced persons camps, in the American zone, where they're going to be protected by the American soldiers.
Right. So for them, in many ways, they were not in Germany. They were in occupied Germany, and they were on the soil, the blood-soaked soil of the perpetrators, but they themselves saw themselves as being in the American zone.
But as you do in your wonderful book, you make it clear that it is not simply.
No.
We've got to tell this story in all the complexity in which it was lived. I mean, the story you tell of the Polish Jews who have German nannies,
yes,
to help, German housekeepers.
There's a lot of interaction with German neighbors. So I think, yes, the deeper we get into the everyday life stories, in all of their gender-specific and age-specific ways, the more we complicate, so these divisions. And yet, I think just trying to really communicate to audiences, whether it's in the U.S. or whether it's in Europe, and less so in Israel, I think, where people do know this story, that yes, the majority of the survivors were people who were not those wrecks or Muslim or skeletal figures who were still liberated right at the end of the war, many of whom, as you point out, also perished very quickly, but mostly Polish Jews who then infiltrated into the American zone, right? Because the Americans allowed them in, and I just find it really difficult in my own teaching and lecturing to make that point without people getting very anxious. It's almost as if one was saying, "Oh, but they weren't," but they weren't really victims of the Nazis. After all, they had survived in the Soviet Union. Or what happened at the time, which is that Germans said, "Wait a minute, you Americans, you're trying to punish us because we supposedly killed all these Jews. So how come they're all around us? How come they're in these DP camps? How come, General Eisenhower said that you can take away our homes when these are actually people who are fleeing communism and not and are not really victims of the Nazis?" And then as you tell the story, which is the irony is that first they have trouble coming in because they're seen as fleeing communism into Germany, and then they have trouble getting out of Germany, because they're associated in Cold War politics with communism.
One of the stories I tell is the story of Joe Berger, who was people may remember his name from his byline in the New York Times. He was the education editor. He was there for many, many years. Joe Berger believed that he was born in Germany in a displaced persons camp. And when it was time for him to go to City College, he had to produce his passport. And he said to his mother, where's my birth certificate? Where's my passport? And she said, "Joey," and she took him aside And she said, I never wanted to tell you this story, but I have to now. When you find your birth certificate, you'll see that you were born in the Soviet Union. And she told her son, who was 18, 19, that he had lived a lie for all those years. And Joey said, why, Mom, why? And his mother said, because if the Americans knew that you were born in the Soviet Union, we never would have gotten into the United States. And the frightening story that transpires, and this is part of my book as well, the Americans say over and over and over again to the Soviets and the Soviet bloc nations, nobody has to go home. They don't have to go back to Poland. They're free to go wherever they want. But the Americans refused to change the immigration laws to let in any displaced persons. And finally, in June of 1948, 3 years after VE Day, a bill is passed by Congress and signed into law by Truman. And it is written in such a way that 90% of the Jewish survivors, those who had spent the war in Poland, were denied the right to get visas as displaced persons. If you were a Nazi collaborator who had come from Estonia into a camp and disguised who you were and where you had been, it was easier to get into the country. And there were a number of Jewish activists who said, why are we American Jews supporting a bill and a law that's going to bring anti-Semites, Nazi war criminals into this country and leave the Jews out? Why were the Jews discriminated against? Why were they kept out of this country? Why was the first Displaced Persons Act written in such a way to keep them out? Because Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans said over and over and over again, you can't trust the Jews. Why? Because they came out of Poland, because they spent time in the Soviet Union, because they revived the ancient Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that the popes had begun to promulgate in the 1920s, that all Jews were Bolsheviks, either operatives, members of the party, sympathizers, and you couldn't let them into the United States of America.
Even though ironically, it was those Polish Jews and Poles actually in general, but who had been in the Soviet Union and had really experienced also the horrors of Soviet rule, as well as the fact that it was a place where it was possible to survive, or at least one was not subject to.
It was, it was blasphemous, to accuse the Jewish DPs of being communist sympathizers was just, it was just dead wrong. And yet it was used effectively. In the end, of the 250,000, the best figures I can come up with are, of the 250,000 Jewish displaced persons in the camps, about 55 to 60,000 of them come to the United States. 150.
80% of those had probably survived in the Soviet Union.
Absolutely, yeah. And they lied.
And one of the points that comes across very strongly in your book in general is the degree to which lying and deception and what today we would call fraud, right? Immigration fraud, which can be used politically today, of course, as an argument against letting in refugees or people seeking a better life. That practically everyone had to make up a story that would be plausible to an officer deciding one's fate. And so, yes, there was a lot of lying. When you're talking about American immigration policy, that it just brings me to one sort of specific question that I didn't want to miss asking you, which is that I feel like one of the heroes in your book is a man named Earl Harrison, who, for reasons that I've never quite understood, does not have a biography and is really unknown. And I was so happy that you sort of foregrounded him, because he's such an important figure. I mean, there are those who say that he is the father of maybe the modern state of Israel, certainly. But he was the one, as you point out, with his famous report, who made the point that in order for Jews to be treated in some way equitably, their different experience, even from that of the suffering of all the other DPs and all those who had suffered during the war, had to be recognized, and therefore they needed to be in separate camps. Right. Now, my question is, can you explain Earl Harrison to me? Because because after all, he was Roosevelt's immigration commissioner. He was in charge of alien registration. I mean, presumably he played a significant role in the detention and internment and surveillance of enemy aliens, including the Japanese. And yet he emerges as such a champion of in particular the Jewish DPs and their rights. I'm just curious.
You know, I found his papers, or some of his papers, are at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and among those papers are his diaries.
Yeah.
And two things happened. He traveled with Joseph Schwartz,
yes,
who was, I guess, with the JDL. With the distribution. And Schwartz said to him from the very beginning, we've got to make our own agenda here. We can't let the army show us where to go. And Harrison was he was aghast. He was disgusted. He could not believe the way the Jews were being treated by the occupation forces. Truman sent him over to report on what was going on, because Morgenthau had learned from Morgenthau, who was a secular Jew, who was not a Zionist in any way. Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of Treasury, had learned from a variety of Jewish friends that the Jews were suffering in the camps. Morgenthau convinced the State Department, who convinced Truman to send Harrison. Harrison came, he saw, he visited the camps, he talked to the displaced persons. And he came back and he said to Truman, we are treating the Jews as badly as the Nazis, except we're not exterminating them. And Harrison wrote in his report, and Truman would later say to Attlee and Ernest Bevin, it is no longer a question of opening the gates of Palestine to millions of Jews. 6 million are gone. We're talking about 100,000. And Harrison said to Truman, you have to immediately find a way to get the Jews out of the camps into Palestine, and in the meantime, make life livable for them in Germany.
And of course, the story that you then go on to tell is that indeed the conditions became much more livable, but that didn't mean that the United States opened its doors and and neither was Britain going to open its doors to Palestine. So, yeah, I mean, I wonder whether Harrison just had some sort of conversion experience, or, did he really think of Jewish DPs in a very different category than, say, Japanese enemy aliens? I mean, we always have this sort of question about the difference between, say, as these are still European refugees as opposed to non-European refugees.
Right.
He really had a very, very, very significant role for which
The British Foreign Office was furious at Truman and at Harrison. The British Foreign Office said everybody suffered during the war, or the displaced persons, whether they're Poles or Ukrainians. And Harrison said, no, the Jews' suffering is singular, it's unique, and the world has to recognize that.
Right. I think we're getting to the point now where we want to take some questions from the audience, even though I feel like we could just go on discussing all of these questions for many hours. And I see there's one here, which follows right along, which is how many of did many of the Polish Jews who returned from the Soviet Union initially go to Łódź before they went to DP camps in Germany? Many could not go back to their hometowns in Poland. I recently found out some of my relatives ended up there. It's a very kind of a very specific question, but it speaks to I think to the fact that so many people have that family history, maybe in our audience.
Yeah, the Polish Jews, when they returned from the Soviet Union, the first thing they did was they went to their hometown, or they went to what were centers of Jewish community life and Jewish organized life. And they did that because they attempted to find, look, there are no telephones, there's no internet. How do you find if anybody's alive? You go to a Jewish community center and you look on the walls and you see if there's a note pasted from a relative who says, I'm alive, this is where I am.
Yeah.
Regrettably, they didn't find many of those notes.
They didn't know. I mean, many of them said that only when they crossed the border did they realize that they had entered a vast graveyard. Some of them thought it was Soviet propaganda about that all the European Jews had been exterminated. So
there are so many stories, frightening stories. There are memoirs that I talk about in my book. There are the Shoah testimonies that deal with that final return to Poland and the sudden recognition that everyone was gone.
Right. There's so many memoirs. Here's maybe a more general question, David. You made a strong and emphatic statement at the top of the hour that it was our xenophobic anti-immigrant moment that not just shaped, but in a way manifested this book. And was there another subject that you were working on before that you might have pursued before the stark rightward turn in 2016? And if so, will you return to it? In other words, have you now turned the corner into international history, or are you?
Yeah.
And what is our politics?
No, there wasn't another subject. When I finished my Kennedy book, I wrote a biography of Joseph P. Kennedy. And I was, again, catapulted into European history and world history because Kennedy's story, Joe Kennedy is the ambassador to Britain, and his son, obviously as president, has to reach out to the rest of the world. But no, this book grabbed me. And one of the things that grabbed me is that I had been reading a lot of Holocaust survivor stories, and I noticed in all of them that the survivors and their families arrived in the United States in 1949, 1950, 1951. And after I had read a dozen of these, it suddenly hit me over the head. Where were they? The war was over in 45.
Right.
That and the Judd book sort of pushed me to, and it took a long time to get into this. Before I knew there was a book there, I had to do a lot of research.
Right. Just like I always would say to people, you know, well, 250,000 survivors. You really think that 250,000 Jews walked out of the killing fields or walked out of Treblinka or Auschwitz? I mean, they, for even that is a tiny number. There were 3.3 million, at least, Jews in Poland before the war, right? But even for that remnant, as you said, the saved remnant, to survive, it required them to be someplace where they were subject to the normal horrors of war, or to terrors that were shared with other Poles, but they were not exterminated. So, and in a way, I think talking about it seemed to me actually that, you know, writing a biography about Joseph Kennedy, maybe in some ways was a good preparation in terms of American policy, in terms of American racism, in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of a certain kind of class politics, maybe even certain kind of gender politics that might have, you know, fed the really sort of this unholy alliance that you describe of Republicans and Southern Democrats who were just determined to keep certain kinds of people out of the country.
The Kennedy book taught me, and I should have known this, that anti-Semitism comes in many flavors. Anti-Semitism takes different forms, different codes, different ways. And I was introduced to that during my research for the Kennedy book. The question that, when I was asked, was Joe Kennedy an anti-Semite? My answer was always, the question is not was he, but what kind of anti-Semite was he? Because in Washington, in the State Department, anti-Semitism was rife. And it did not disappear. The rhetoric changed, the language changed, the coding changed. But anti-Semitism in Poland, in Britain, and in the United States did not end with the death of Hitler in his bunker.
So here's another question that actually sort of takes us maybe to the enduring legacy or the continued after effects of what happened when people didn't have any place to go, and the only place that they could go was someplace that was already lived on by other peoples. So the question is, can you imagine what might have happened had Britain opened the doors to Palestine? Or maybe just to put it in other ways, the counterfactual that always sort of, you know, obsessed me, which was, yes, you know, the Anglo-American report, you kind of read it and weep, because it does talk about sort of finding a just solution for Jews and Arabs. And yeah, what might have happened if those 100,000 certificates had been issued already in 1946? Yeah, and if the doors hadn't opened only with the establishment of the State of Israel in May of 48?
It's a great question. What would have happened was the United Kingdom and the United States and the nations of the world would have had to have taken some responsibility for not simply peacekeeping, but nation building in the Middle East. The British were irresponsible, criminally irresponsible in so many different ways. Just as they walked away from India, Pakistan, leaving behind them millions of casualties and a crisis that exists today in the Middle East, they did the same thing. It was possible, I believe, and the United Nations was moving in a direction with the help of Ralph Bunche of finding a way to create a new type of society, either two nations or one nation. We don't know, and we will never know. But I think there were possibilities that were lost when the British walked away and when the Americans refused to do anything. Truman's first ambassador to Israel many times went to see Ben Gurion, and he said to Ben Gurion, "You've got to let some of the Palestinians back in. That's American policy." And Ben Gurion said, "No, not until there's a formal peace treaty with every Arab nation." Now that was not going to happen. And Truman said, "Okay, okay."
Right.
My book is, I've said this too many times, there are irony on top of irony. The Jewish displaced persons are not and were not responsible for the displacement of the Palestinians. They didn't do it. Nonetheless, it is a fact of history that the Jewish displaced persons were placed by the Israelis on settlements, in farming communities, in kibbutzes, which had been expanded, in apartment buildings in Haifa, and throughout the Galilee that had been abandoned by Palestinians. Now, whether the Palestinians left because they were fearful of their lives, whether they were pushed out by the Israeli army, is less important than the fact that the state of Israel refused to allow any possibility of their return. So the only place for the displaced Jews was in homes from which Palestinians had been displaced.
Yeah. And if we think about what might have been had the British been willing to open up the doors of Palestine for really 100,000 people at that time, and if the Americans had been willing to open their doors at the same time, and then we would have had a very, very different situation in 1948. Although we'll never know, because the sort of rigid immigration and population policies of both of those countries, both of those powers, prevented it. So I guess that leaves us with questions that we can't answer this evening, but how we take your book and the story you tell about these different groups of displaced persons, and how difficult it was for them to find homes, and how relatively easier it was for some groups than for others, and how that might affect the ways we understand our current questions about refugees and immigration, which I know is something that you have spoken about on other occasions, and I'm sure is at the back of, or maybe the front of, many of our audience's minds. So, but I think we are running out of time. And so I just want to thank, first of all, the audience for being there with us, even though we can't see you, and asking questions, and David for a really disturbing but eye-opening evening about sort of breaking down breaking down myths. Maybe that could be your last word. Is that, do you think, do you think of your book as a kind of myth breaker on various?
Absolutely, absolutely. If it does that, I'll be a happy man, a happy historian.
A happy historian. Okay, well, I think there's a whole series of myths and also silences that were not silences, that myths that we can break open and speak about, and other stories that were supposedly silent but actually weren't at the time, such as the experiences that you draw on, the memoirs and the oral histories that you bring to us in this book. Okay, well then I wish everyone a good evening, and once again, thank you to the New York Public Library for this forum, and thank you to David, and thank you for writing this really extraordinary book that
Thank you.
Bye and good night.
Black text on white background. New York Public Library lion logo, 125 years. Learn more about the New York Public Library, nypl.org.